Hello and welcome to this edition of Proficio Cyber Chats. Joining us for today's chat is Rick McElroy, Principal Security Strategist for Carbon Black, and Proficio's own SOC Director, Carl Adassa. On this episode, our guests are going to be discussing tips on building a mature cyber organization and ways to address the cyber skills gap, as well as advice on fighting that ever-persistent war on cybercrime. Let's chat. With so many tools and resources out there for organizations to really fortify their security profile, how can they tell if they've built a resilient cybersecurity program?
I think that's a good question. I mean, especially when faced in the middle of a pandemic. I think, it should have always been planned, should have been part of the programs, but I can guarantee it probably wasn't prioritized that high over new project initiatives, trying to close gaps in compliance, right? So, but I do think, it's something that I deeply thought about. And I think one of the areas you can start to look at is like you can map dependencies to who actually knows how to do those dependencies. So as an example, if you only have one threat hunter, chances are you have no resiliency in your threat hunting program. If certain processes run through certain individuals and the team's not cross-trained on those, that's an area to look at. And then I certainly think, the way I always thought about managed security providers as well is it's a good chance to leapfrog some maturity. So have my team go focus on areas I need them to, like culture, the people, actually identifying the systems that we need to protect and get into a known state. But I also think it presents a great way to build resiliency into your program. So if I have a partner like Proficio or any of the other vendors that are out there, what I get is continuity in operations. Like their team is going to continue to mature on their path through their operational processes, and they'll actually be able to help get up to speed some of the new defenders that you bring in. So that's how I generally kind of think strategically about resiliency in my program and managed security providers.
Yeah, and really piggybacking off what Rick mentioned really in his opening statement, which is it should have always been planned. I think preparation is key. Similar to your incident response life cycle, right? Preparation is the first step. Organizations typically will have a business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, and I wonder how much of that was actually used when the COVID-19 really started to spread and really started to impact operations and really started to impact the workforce of an organization. So maybe there wasn't a specific line in there for a global pandemic, but was your business continuity plan written well enough or covered this kind of situation where you had to literally clear your entire workforce from the office? And now we're starting to see that some companies are going to choose that, a remote workforce is going to be the new norm, up to 50%, maybe up to 75 to even 100% of the workforce now is going to become remote work. And so I think now your business continuity plan, something that, let's admit, maybe some business leaders only focused on it that once a year when the auditor came into town, right? You kind of just brush off the dust. But now I think more important than ever, those kinds of policies and plans that were put in place for these type of scenarios really went through a stress test. And a real world scenario, happened in unprecedented times. So I'm really curious to see, resiliency is in my part, part preparation, right? And so how was your business continuity plan, your disaster recovery? Have you guys stabilized your operations? And really, what are you going to do now to go back, revise it, update it, and make sure it's evolved into really what I think is going to be the post-COVID workforce for companies?
Yeah, Carl, that you kind of hit on a thing I wanted to talk about as well, which is like, companies had disaster recovery plans, they had business continuity plans, but generally speaking, most of those organizations are going to gear those around regional things, right? So on the West Coast, right, we certainly have disaster recovery plans for fires. I've been part of 2 organizations that sent employees home because the fires were too close, right? But I think this idea of a nested supply chain, a global supply chain, added to varying levels of continuity amongst that, right? So everything from can providers still continue to provide that high level of service when employees have been disrupted and sent home? I think is important. So I think for the teams out there, it's a good chance to audit. I can almost guarantee you've got a list of things that were broke as a result. So do what we always do, which is keep a list, mature on the list, and eventually we'll get to a better spot.
I'm sure we all have seen the data regarding the increase in demand for cybersecurity professionals and the lack of qualified individuals to fill those positions. What advice or tips would you give to an organization struggling with the cyber skills gap?
So the big thing that I hear from CISOs is build your own pipeline. Like, don't expect recruiting to solve your problems. So have relationships with local universities, have relationships in the community where you're out in front of the community, actively recruiting for your company at all times, whether you have positions or not. And I think the other thing that is going to be helpful for teams is, in the end, there are some silver linings to any sort of disaster. And I think in this case, one of the silver linings is going to be that a lot of companies, for their own purposes and because the people were kind of in the way, chose not to have remote workforces. Right? It was just a choice. They weren't used to managing people remote or doing all those things, and I think that's gone. COVID definitely ripped the duct tape off on that. So I think we'll actually have a wider recruiting pool. So I think in the future there'll be a number of people that are available that weren't today. And then I think the other area I think about, whenever you have a massive displacement of a workforce, I hope that there's incentives and programs put into place to train some of those people who were put out of work and get them into cyber. And there's varying arguments about that, but look, there's a lot of people out of work. We got a lot of jobs that are open. Let's get some of those people into the Army.
Absolutely agree. And when it comes to the skills gap, and addressing that from an organization, even from cybersecurity globally, it is really tough. When you can get a pipeline like Rick mentioned, and then you finally get them in, I think you also, as a business and really the cybersecurity space, have to consider the tools that we're putting in front of them, even as far as making sure it's intuitive, it's, visually easy to navigate. And I think a lot of tools these days are heavily focused on the big data. They're heavily focused on the processing power, and then forget that there's going to be a human in front of it at some point. And so when you have to consider that the person in front of it is not going to be your most senior person. It may be an intern coming into an organization, and we may require this intern to start looking at data in a different way. And so I think technology also has to kind of take into consideration who is my audience, and it may not always be an advanced threat hunter who understands, multiple levels of cybersecurity. And so coincidentally, I'm a big proponent of, Carbon Black. I've used it for several years now. And what makes it easy for me to use as somebody who does an investigation during incident response is it kind of helps me walk through the incident, right? I'm not guessing for the most part. It allows me, it guides me through an incident, an investigation, and puts it out in front of me where I can easily just move fast. And sometimes, during an incident, time is of the essence. We all know that. And so when you have technology that can also kind of play its part in the skills gap, I think it's maybe one of those hidden things that's not really discussed and really considered as a high priority as far as how do we address the skills gap, right? So,
can you provide our listeners out there any advice or tips in building a mature cybersecurity program?
One of my main tips that we harp on here is you need to understand your business first. Before you reach out and you go to providers and you start picking technologies, I think understanding your business is key. And then once you understand your business, and really where I'm trying to go with this is understanding your crown jewels, and then as you start to focus on your crown jewels, you start to put protections around that first, because, this is what's going to either make or break your business if it's a compromise. And so when you start to invest in different technologies, reach out to different partners for programs and things like that, if they don't cover your crown jewels and what's essential to your business, it's almost a wasted investment. You're also wasting time. So really, my main tip is understand your business, and understanding your business is understanding what's critical to your success of your business, making sure that the steps that you do, the technologies that you pick, the partners that you choose, really align with what your business is trying to accomplish. And I think for the most part, oftentimes we may not have security folks on staff that understand, how to formulate a plan and how to go about picking the right partners. And so I think you also have to figure who then do we need to bring in to help us assess this? And oftentimes you may have to bring in a third party, just as a non-biased assessment to give you a good detailed plan. And so hopefully, with this tip, you'll have a faster way to mature, because I think prioritizing your key assets for your business is key.
I think about a couple of things. One, don't try to boil the ocean and put in 15 controls at once. Two, I think about where I want to be and the outcomes that I want to drive for my business. To Carl's point, it's key, like knowing what your business does and knowing what they care about, and knowing where they're going in the future so you can enable that. That's going to be key for your program, right? But I got to think about the outcomes that I need to drive to secure my particular threats, my particular data that affects that particular organization, right? And there is no, I wish there was a form factor for it because we'd all be more secure, right? But no. And then the other thing I think about when it comes to technology maturing is give your team to operationalize tools. And I don't actually care if that's an external third party that you're bringing in from a managed detection and response or an MSSP perspective, or your own teammates with some new technology. It's like putting it in. It doesn't accomplish the mission. It's in, but are you tuning it? Is there a loop? Do they have time to operationalize it? Have you built that in and thought about that as you're approaching the rest of your technology stack? The other tip I have around technology and maturing is use the fewest number of tools that you actually need to accomplish the mission. Far too often you see teams that have excellent engineers, excellent analysts, but they don't have time to go do their job. What they're actually doing is the maintenance of security, adding that latest update, adding those patches. And it's why Carbon Black started to build and has built a cloud. A lot of our customers came back to us and said, look, the overhead to run this stuff is just too big. Can you do it for us? And we said yes and delivered on that. So I think it's important to have that time to operationalize and tune your tools as part of your workflow.
And to piggyback off what Rick mentioned about, tools in the tool bag really, and really simplifying our tool set as an organization. Oftentimes we want to bring in as many tools to do the job, but oftentimes it makes it more complex to manage. And so when you have security engineers responsible for 15 different type of technologies and 15 different platforms, it does make your job harder as an organization to really be scalable. And so we're looking for, simple yet complex platforms. And looking at Carbon Black, for example, sometimes, when we do managed detection response for some of these companies, I go to Proficio, I have a big smile on my face when I know that they have an EDR platform, because we're no longer relying on your on-prem firewalls. We're no longer relying on devices and technologies that are only dependent upon a user being on site. And so with the remote workforce really now being, this post-COVID landscape, the perimeter has gone far beyond the workforce and the workspace. So VPNs, I don't even remember the last time I really had to VPN to do my job, other than maybe getting into a jump server. Right. And so now that we have cloud-based services like Office 365, now the protection that we used to have for users on premise are really no longer there. And so how, not only are they not protected, but how are we keeping sure that they're being monitored? And so without an EDR, which is, in my opinion, probably one of the most critical pieces to add to the security toolbox for an organization, it's going to really make security challenging. It's going to make IT challenging. And so one of the things that we look for, at least in a partner, especially in an EDR platform, is not only can I monitor that endpoint, but can I connect to it? Can I isolate it from the network? Can I find more information without having to reach out to the user themselves? So I think remote connectivity is also extremely important. It allows your IT on staff, or even your security team on staff, to be flexible. I think it allows them to be scalable, because not only are we looking at users at home, but users that travel overseas, and having that EDR platform that's cloud-based, it really, really makes security's job easier.
Yeah, Carl, I would say everybody in the company appreciates the feedback on that, right? Because that's why the tool was built. Like where's the innovation that attackers are doing? Is it a DDoS? No. Amazon just mitigated the largest DDoS that's ever happened on Earth, and no one knew. Like, they had to put a press release out about it, which is fantastic, right? Because people often think we haven't solved, or at least mitigated, some security problems. And I assure you, we've mitigated a lot, even though we're still having breaches. Well, what's happened, right? The innovation started to happen on endpoints, started to happen on servers, started to happen where users moved. So you saw mobile exploits come up, recent news about CEOs and their iPhones being breached and all of that good stuff, because that's where the data is, right? And so for us, especially in a world where I don't control that home network device, I don't control most of the devices that are on that home network, like it becomes even more critical to have that endpoint visibility. And then to go back to the question about maturity, right? One of the reasons I came to Carbon Black, I've never worked for another vendor, but one of the reasons is I think I misspent a lot of money along the way, because I was trying to solve problems that maybe I didn't actually have, because I didn't have the data to say that, right? And EDR is a great way to check the rest of your stack. So you have things that are supposed to be blocking and tuning out phishing attacks. Awesome. Your EDR will tell you if that's actually occurring, right? You're supposed to have content filtering that keeps you from getting a website redirected. All of these things that we see users interact with, it's like, I need a single source of truth. What's landing on my endpoint that's actually going to land me in the headlines? And I think for us, that's what EDR represents.
In your opinion, what is significantly influencing the cybersecurity industry today?
Look, I'll tell you the biggest thing that I think has had the largest impact to the entire industry, and we're big fans, MITRE ATT&CK. If you have not adopted some sort of emulation or MITRE ATT&CK-based testing methodology for your tool set, I don't know why you haven't yet, right? And I get we're all busy, all of those things, but look, here's what it's going to allow you to do. As you're onboarding a new product, does that product actually catch the TTPs that you care about? The two I always point people to are credential harvesting and lateral movement. If you can stop lateral movement, chances are most of the attacks are going to stop on one endpoint. If I can stop credential harvesting, so many other nefarious things are leveraged based off just doing a credential dump out of Windows, right? So look, here's how I recommend people do that, is like start small. Do not go after every single MITRE ATT&CK. If you turn it on, you're going to have a ton of false positives and you're not going to be able to tune, right? As you start to employ emulation, and there's some automated frameworks to do that. There's some great companies that are doing that and have that productized. And then of course, red team should have that capability. So now you start to test your endpoint. Now you start to test your network. Then you look at the specific areas of risk. And I would say, again, APTs aside, lateral movement, credential harvesting, and you can actually start to measure your detections on that as you're running emulations, as you're running these attacks. Okay, awesome. So you need to go tune your network IPS or your next-gen firewall to be able to alert you on some of this stuff. Sweet. MITRE really gives you a good framework to do that. And then the industry's been great by giving everybody a blueprint to do it that didn't have the resources or didn't have the teams that were trained, which is one of the reasons that we're a huge fan, because I can't think of much in recent history that's changed the industry as much as that one has.
And to piggyback again off MITRE, really, it gives us that blueprint, like what Rick said. And sometimes, in an organization, you don't have somebody who can dedicate research to just MITRE ATT&CK techniques and procedures. And so what do? And so you have to rely sometimes on these products, these vendors, these partners that really do have the R&D teams, the research teams to invest that time that's really needed to understand it and start to question some of the vendors you already have. Maybe some of your third parties, are they aware of MITRE? How long have they been working on MITRE? How mature are they are in MITRE? Because I think that plays a big role as far as really helping filter out the vendors and platforms and programs that really don't make the cut. Because if you're not looking at MITRE, if you're not looking at it as integrating with your technology and your rule sets and things like that, you're really falling behind. And in cybersecurity, as we all know, it evolves faster than anything that we've seen before. Every day it's a new threat, every hour it's a new variant, every minute there's a new group that's trying to do something else to bypass everything we've done so far. So if you don't have, a partner, especially like Carbon Black, that really spends their time to invest in MITRE, and really out of the box when we turn it on, we can automatically get MITRE protection, right? Or MITRE detection, really. And so without that, really start to question who you're working with and what their end goal is. Because if MITRE is not being used, I really don't know any other framework. You have NIST and things like that, and cyber kill chain, really good at the broad level, but MITRE really dissects it even further. And I think seeing out of the box rules coming from Carbon Black and what they're doing to detect things, it really gives you, at least somebody who's kind of jumping into this, really some insight on how to detect it. Because you can go to MITRE, you can see the matrix and you can see, quick definitions, but it's like, okay, great, but technically speaking, how do I find this? What artifacts on the system am I looking for? What traffic patterns within the network are we really looking for? What devices are required to even create MITRE detection? So, find yourself a good partner and make sure that they're using MITRE, because I think more so than ever, we're really going to rely on MITRE moving forward.
Yeah, and Carl, I'll just piggyback right on that too. We'll just keep going. I talked about this earlier, leapfrog and maturity. I've greenfield built a lot of security programs. I'm sure a ton of the audience has. We've all been in shops under investment. You got to go make that initial calls on technology. And so I think about two things, like some early mistakes that I made and some wisdom that I picked up. One, not treating managed partners as actually being on my team. And what do I mean by that, right? It's like, well, you're a vendor, I'm going to beat you over the head when you fail. I'm not really going to engage you proactively along the journey. And ultimately, shocker, you get terrible results, right? You get subpar results at that. So I think treating your partners, even if they're vendors, like trust the vendors. Trust me, I moved over to this side and I was waiting for nefarious activity to occur. I've seen no nefarious activity. In fact, I think people's hearts are all in the right place. Sometimes execution is just done poorly, right? So everybody, if you're buying a piece of technology, they're on your team. If they're managing part of your stack, they're on your team. If they're triaging alerts, they're on your team. And so to go back to the leapfrog again, how long would it take me from day zero to go build a mature hunt practice or a mature detection and response practice using MITRE ATT&CK? Well, I got to recruit the right resources. 6 to 9 months is what I hear from all of my CISO friends to actually do that. If you're lucky, maybe that changes post-COVID. So I'm already 9 months behind on my program. Great. I just bought a tool. Okay. Maybe that tool is called Carbon Black. Maybe it's another EDR tool. Now I need to send my team to training. Now I got to implement it. Right now, I got to tune. I got to do all these things. I got to create my own custom watch lists. I got to go to our user exchange, start learning that stuff. And look, it's not to say teams don't do that. And I don't have a one size fit all prescription for any of that. It's dependent on the org. But what I do know is that I'd rather invest that money in a strong partner who has already done those things and take advantage of that. And then again, for myself, culture is more important than the tech inside of an organization. Like, go focus on the people portion of security. So I think that's the big consideration I have around maturity, tuning, and leapfrogging.
I think you touched on another point there, which is the vendor and not treating them like a third party vendor. And really what you need to build with that vendor is trust. And if you don't trust that vendor to monitor your networks and know the deep secrets of your assets and things like that, then it's really hard to be successful in that partnership. And so, with Proficio, one of the main things that we like to do is response, right? So manage detection and response. So we're not just your traditional MSSP. We're not just going to get your logs, send you a bunch of noise, a bunch of alerts, and really not help you in the response part of it. And so what we've been able to do here at Proficio is integrate our technology stack with the customer's technology stack or the client's technology stack, I might add. So, when we can detect something, at any given time, 24/7, 365, and respond on your behalf, and really be that extension of your team. We are part of your staff. We are part of your team. And so if you can't trust us to be in that position, I think you really start to see the variance of quality of service from different vendors. And so, like I said, as an extension, you should trust that your partner will be able to make the smart decision, be able to understand your business and understand the implications of, hey, if I isolate this system, am I going to cripple this network? Or if I isolate this system, what are my protocols? What are my procedures before I do that? And really, this is where I think you kind of get into a unique space as a partner with clients who really need cybersecurity, services professionals, but just don't have the ability to really staff that up because it's challenging as it is. And so, again, just to kind of reiterate, trusting your partner and understanding, how far can they go deep in your technology stack, so that way we can respond to the incident, respond to these threats. Because on the flip side, we're working with partners such as, the Carbon Blacks of the world, who are also pushing the innovation. And so when we can work with innovative partners, that trickles down to the client. And really, I think this is where we need to go, because, cybersecurity is not easy to fund. It's not easy to build. It's not easy to mature. And so how do you kind of create shortcuts, but at the same time, you don't sacrifice your own security as an organization?
A lot of people consider cybersecurity to be kind of the digital wild, wild west. How would you take control of the battlefield?
So security is the Wild West. What do you do to control the battlefield? Ooh, this is my topic because I do a lot of blogs on this. For me personally, I have a couple different, I would call them like guiding principles, I think, a lot of which were adopted. I'm a former Marine, right? So a lot of which sort of moved out of the physical warfare space into the cyber warfare space. Simply put, I think of modern the current cyber war that we're in as hand-to-hand combat. And I think the UFC and MMA provide some pretty good context on that, right? So if you think about it and look at the history of mixed martial arts, it started off one discipline alone won. Then you saw wrestlers come into the sport. All right. Well, the sport changed. Everybody had to adapt. They started winning championships. Then you saw boxers start to enter the sport. Then you saw the sport actually become a well-rounded sport, including jiu-jitsu and all of the other things, right? So when I think about what you need to do to run your cyber operations in an agile way, in a way where you can improvise, overcome, and adapt on the enemy, what you're going to have to do is pick and choose your battles. So there's going to be certain areas where, hey, that data is going to be deprioritized because maybe you can't afford to provide all of the tools that you need, right? That are going to give you the hand-to-hand combat skills. To Carl's earlier point about response, right? This is what I mean. What you see from the bad actors out there, you see them countering incident response activity all the time now. I think our latest report says it occurs 30% of the time. You're also seeing island hopping being leveraged, right? So all of these other ways, because we've hardened some of our systems, we've hardened our networks and kind of changed some of the sophistication level for the bad actors. I think the other thing I think about is the home field advantage that defenders give up all the time. Simply put, and I've been in some big rooms with some big CISOs and gotten in some big arguments about this, know your things. Like if you're not in a known state, then how can you expect to defend it? So I got to get to a known state. I got to know where my assets are. I got to know the types of threats that face those assets, and then I can start to build incident response processes, protective strategies, detective strategies, all of those things. So simply put, think about preventing where you can, and there are areas of prevention. I think I told you earlier, we're doing DDoS mitigation and no one even notices now, right? Next-gen antivirus, like that's gonna stop most of this stuff. And then you have the rest, the things that you're gonna have to build detection and response. So always think about the blind spots on your systems. Always think about that response plan when the blind spots do get hit. And I think it puts you in a place to be able to anticipate what the adversary is going to do and move to counter it when they do.
You know, in an organization, it's how are you making it easier for the attackers when they get in to move around laterally, to go around undetected. And some of these groups, I mean, they're extremely sophisticated. You know, they're not going to be firing off a bunch of alerts to you know, technology that says, hey, I'm going to look for brute forcing 50 times in 2 minutes. Oftentimes they've adapted, you know, and they're going low and slow. They're probably doing one authentication attempt per week. And I don't know if there's any rule that's created to catch that and alert an analyst, for an example. And because it's just not something that we're going to be handling effectively. And so when you think about Wild Wild West, again, how are we making this easier for them when they get in? And are we even making it easier for them to get in the first place? You know, when I think about cybersecurity, it's like having an alarm system for your house. It's great, but what happens if you don't arm it? And what happens if you leave the windows open? You know, you can spend a lot of money protecting the perimeter, but, you know, you trust the mailman when you open the door. Should you always trust that person when you open the door? And so you kind of have to treat everybody that way. People you've trusted, partners you've trusted, services you've trusted, you know, and oftentimes what we see is these attackers, you know, with MITRE and things like that, they're taking advantage of known good services. So I may not look at every command prompt launch or every PowerShell that's launched, because to me it's normal activity. But for the attackers, they know that's what it's going to be normal. They know they can evade detections, and so they're going to live off the land, is what, you know, some people like to call it. And so how do you make it tougher for them? Well, make it tougher to get in. Make it tougher to move around laterally. Make it tougher to abuse services that are standard with Microsoft and things like that. You know, RDP and the SMBs of the world. And so, you know, they take advantage of these because there's weak protections in place. And I think organizations have to really figure out, you know, what's the priority. And sometimes just getting your house in order may be the top priority. And I've been on some security teams where, you know, we're the new kids on the block, and we want to make some changes. And some of the changes that we feel are really simple but really effective, you know, they come with huge resistance. You know, you hear things like, hey, we want to remove you know, admin rights on these systems because they don't need admin rights. Well, you know, we don't want to do that. It's going to disrupt the developers. You know, they need time, they need to work fast, they have tight deadlines. And so you get in this battle with the business of, you know, security is disrupting my business and it's slowing us down. And so I think security definitely gets a lot of resistance, but at the same time, you know, because we're not able to do these things and adapt and integrate with the business, we're also keeping the business at risk, and we're keeping it in the Wild Wild West. And so the challenge, I think, for a lot of security guys and gals and security leadership when they join the organization is, how do you not become a disruptor? Right? How do you enable the business to move fast, to move securely, and to do the job? And so, the Wild Wild West is something that, it makes it hard, for us as security, even as security folks. And so let's not make it easier for the attacker and the adversaries.
We would like to thank Rick McElroy and Carl Adassa for joining us on this episode of Proficio Cyber Chats. If you have any questions or comments regarding any of the topics discussed today, please feel free to reach out to us at proficio.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you tune in to the next episode of Proficio Cyber Chats.